It was a cold, quiet evening in the suburbs of Chicago. The streets were almost empty, save for the occasional car passing by. Marcus Hayes, a well-respected federal prosecutor known for his work on civil rights cases, was driving home after a long day at the office. His mind was filled with thoughts of the case he had been working on, a high-profile lawsuit against a corrupt politician who had abused their power to harm innocent people. Marcus had spent hours poring over documents and preparing arguments, but now, finally, he was heading back to his cozy apartment to unwind. As Marcus turned onto a dimly lit street lined with modest houses, he noticed something unusual in his rearview mirror. Red and blue flashing lights appeared behind him, reflecting off the windshield. At first, he felt confused. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any traffic laws that he could recall. Still, being the law-abiding person he was, Marcus pulled over to the side of the road without hesitation. He put the car in park and waited patiently, watching as the police cruiser approached from behind. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, his silhouette visible through the glare of the headlights. It was Officer Daniel Grayson, a man whose face Marcus didn't recognize but whose demeanor immediately struck him as odd. There was an air of hostility about Grayson as he walked toward Marcus's car, his boots clicking loudly against the pavement. Instead of the usual calm professionalism one might expect during a routine traffic stop, Grayson seemed tense and agitated right from the start. When Grayson reached the driver's side window, he tapped sharply on the glass with his flashlight, startling Marcus. "License and registration," Grayson barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus nodded politely and reached into his pocket to grab his wallet. As he did so, he glanced up at the officer and said calmly, "Can I ask why I was pulled over? I wasn't speeding." Grayson didn't answer. Instead, his eyes narrowed and he leaned closer to the window, shining the flashlight directly into Marcus's face. The bright light made it hard for Marcus to see anything clearly, but he could sense the tension radiating from the officer. Something about the situation felt off. Routine traffic stops usually involved a brief exchange and maybe a warning or ticket if there was a minor infraction. This, however, felt different, more intense, more personal. Marcus tried again to ease the tension. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on here," he said, keeping his tone measured and respectful. But instead of responding, Grayson muttered something under his breath. Though Marcus couldn't make out the exact words, the tone was unmistakable. It carried a hint of disdain, almost as if Grayson was mocking him. For a moment, Marcus considered asking the officer to repeat himself, but he decided against it. He knew better than to escalate things unnecessarily, especially when dealing with someone in uniform. Instead, he focused on complying with Grayson's demands. Slowly and deliberately, Marcus opened his glove compartment to retrieve his registration papers. Every movement was careful, deliberate, and non-threatening. Yet, despite his best efforts to remain calm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The seconds ticked by like hours as Grayson continued to hover outside the car, his presence looming large. Marcus couldn't help but notice how tightly the officer gripped his flashlight, as though it might double as a weapon if needed. It was unsettling, to say the least. And then, just as Marcus was about to hand over his documents, Grayson suddenly snapped, "What are you reaching for? Keep your hands where I can see them." Startled, Marcus froze mid-motion. "I'm just getting my registration," he explained quickly, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. But Grayson didn't seem satisfied. If anything, his expression grew darker, angrier. His grip tightened around the flashlight and his other hand moved instinctively toward the holster on his belt. At that moment, Marcus realized this wasn't going to end well. Despite his position as a federal prosecutor, a role that required him to uphold justice and fairness, he wasn't immune to the biases and prejudices that plagued society. In fact, his skin color often made him a target in situations like this, even though he worked tirelessly to combat such injustices every single day. Tonight, it seemed, those same biases were rearing their ugly head once again. As Grayson's behavior became increasingly erratic, Marcus braced himself for whatever might come next. Little did he know the events unfolding would not only change his life forever, but also ignite a firestorm of controversy that would ripple across the nation. For now, though, all he could do was sit silently in his car, hoping against hope that reason and logic would prevail before things spiraled completely out of control. The tension between Marcus and Officer Grayson continued to escalate, turning what should have been a routine traffic stop into something far more sinister. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, his hands raised slightly above the steering wheel as he tried to maintain eye contact with the officer through the glare of the flashlight. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum roll in his ears. He had done everything right, followed instructions, remained calm, and shown no signs of aggression. But none of that seemed to matter to Grayson. Grayson's demeanor had shifted from suspicious to outright hostile. His voice was sharp and biting, cutting through the stillness of the night like shards of glass. "Don't move," he shouted again, emphasizing every word with a jab of his flashlight toward Marcus's face. The beam blinded Marcus momentarily, forcing him to squint and turn his head slightly away. It wasn't just the light that made him uncomfortable. It was the weight of the situation, the sense that this encounter could take a dangerous turn at any moment. Marcus tried one last time to defuse the situation. "Officer," he said, his tone measured and steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "I'm not reaching for anything dangerous. I'm just trying to get my registration, so we can resolve this quickly." He spoke slowly, enunciating each word carefully, hoping that clarity might help Grayson see reason. But instead of calming the officer down, his words seemed to have the opposite effect. Grayson leaned closer to the window, his face contorted with anger. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Talking. Fancy, acting all innocent. I know your type." Marcus blinked, unsure of how to respond. What did Grayson mean by your type? Was he referring to Marcus's profession, or was it something else entirely? Something deeper, darker, rooted in prejudice. Before Marcus could process the implications of those loaded words, Grayson muttered something under his breath. Though it was muffled, Marcus caught fragments of it. "Always thinking you're better, and don't belong here." The realization hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about a missing taillight or expired tags. This wasn't even about whether he'd been speeding or not. This was about who he was, the color of his skin, the way he carried himself, the very essence of his identity. And in that instant, Marcus understood that no amount of compliance or politeness would change Grayson's mindset. The officer had already made up his mind about him long before pulling him over. Despite the growing dread in his stomach, Marcus refused to let fear consume him. He took a deep breath, attempting to project calmness even as his pulse raced. "Officer," he began again, choosing his words carefully. "I'm cooperating fully. You can check my license and registration. I haven't broken any laws tonight." But Grayson wasn't listening anymore. His hand hovered dangerously close to the holster on his hip, his fingers twitching as if itching to draw his weapon. "Shut up," he barked, his voice rising to a near shout. "I gave you an order. Keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus obeyed immediately, raising both hands higher so they were clearly visible through the car window. He locked his gaze onto Grayson, searching for some sign of rationality, some flicker of humanity beneath the rage. But all he saw was cold hostility, a mask of authority used to justify unchecked power. Time seemed to slow down as the seconds dragged on. The only sounds were the hum of the idling police cruiser behind them and the faint rustle of leaves swaying in the chilly night breeze. Marcus's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he keep talking, hoping to appeal to whatever shred of decency Grayson might possess? Or should he stay silent, avoiding anything that could be misconstrued as defiance? Before he could decide, Grayson's behavior took another alarming turn. He stepped back abruptly, his hand now firmly gripping the handle of his gun. "Get out of the car," he commanded, his voice loud enough to startle nearby birds into flight. "Now!" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brain struggling to catch up with the sudden demand. Getting out of the car felt risky, exposing himself further to Grayson's volatile temper. but refusing to comply would likely make things worse. With trembling hands, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open, stepping cautiously onto the pavement. "Hands on the roof of the car," Grayson ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. Marcus complied without hesitation, placing his palms flat against the cool metal surface. He spread his legs apart as instructed, feeling utterly vulnerable under the harsh glare of the police lights. Each movement was deliberate, calculated to avoid giving Grayson any excuse to escalate further. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. Perhaps Grayson would realize there was no threat here, no reason to detain him beyond issuing a warning or writing a ticket. But then came the sound that shattered that fragile hope, a metallic click, unmistakable and chilling. Grayson had drawn his gun. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't see the weapon, but he didn't need to. The sound alone was enough to send waves of panic coursing through his body. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "There's no need for this. I'm not resisting." But Grayson didn't lower the gun. Instead, he moved closer, circling around the car until he stood directly behind Marcus. "Reach for your wallet again," he growled, his tone laced with menace. "Go ahead, see what happens." Marcus swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper. He hadn't planned to reach for anything. He was too scared to move. But Grayson's words left no room for misinterpretation. Any sudden action, no matter how innocent, could provoke disaster. So he stayed perfectly still, his muscles rigid, with tension, praying silently for anyone to intervene. And then, without warning, Grayson screamed, "I said don't move!" His voice cracked with fury, and in the same instant the deafening crack of a gunshot split the air. Pain exploded in Marcus's leg, searing through muscle and bone like fire. He collapsed to the ground, clutching his thigh as blood began to pool beneath him. The world spun wildly around him, colors blurring together as shock set in. Through the haze of agony, he heard Grayson shouting, though the words were indistinct, muffled by the ringing in his ears. As Marcus lay bleeding on the cold asphalt, his thoughts raced chaotically. Why had this happened? What had he done to deserve this? The irony wasn't lost on him, that a man whose job was to seek justice for others had become a victim of such blatant injustice himself. But there was no time to dwell on those questions. Now, survival was all that mattered. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder with each passing second. Other officers were arriving on the scene, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Whether their presence would bring relief or further danger remained to be seen. For now, Marcus could only cling to consciousness, fighting against the darkness threatening to swallow him whole. The gunshot echoed through the quiet suburban street, shattering the stillness of the night. Marcus fell to the ground with a cry, his leg buckling under the force of the bullet that had torn through flesh and muscle. Pain radiated from the wound, sharp and unrelenting, as blood began to soak through his pants, pooling darkly on the asphalt beneath him. He lay there, gasping for breath, his vision swimming between flashes of red and blue police lights overhead. For a moment it felt like time had stopped, like the world itself had frozen in shock at what had just happened. Officer Grayson stood over him, his gun still raised, trembling slightly in his grip. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of panic and defiance. The sound of his own breathing filled his ears, fast and uneven, as if trying to catch up with the chaos he had unleashed. He looked down at Marcus, who was clutching his injured leg, moaning softly in pain. Grayson's lips moved, but no words came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky, almost frantic. He reached for something," Grayson stammered, glancing around wildly as though searching for someone to confirm his version of events. "I thought he was going for a weapon, but—" Marcus hadn't been reaching for anything. Not then, not ever during this encounter. He had followed every command, complied with every demand, and yet here he was, bleeding on the cold pavement because of an assumption based on fear and prejudice. The injustice of it burned hotter than the physical pain in his leg. Through gritted teeth, Marcus managed to choke out, "I didn't do anything." His voice was weak, barely audible over the growing commotion. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer with each passing second. Other officers were arriving on the scene now, their cars screeching to a halt behind Grayson's cruiser. Doors slammed shut, and boots pounded against the pavement as they rushed toward the unfolding drama. Some of them immediately crouched, beside Marcus assessing his condition, while others turned their attention to Grayson demanding an explanation. "What happened here?" one officer barked, his tone sharp and urgent. Grayson hesitated, his gaze darting nervously between Marcus and the group of officers surrounding him. "He reached for something," he repeated, louder this time, as if saying it again would make it true. "I thought he was armed. I had to protect myself." Marcus wanted to scream, to tell them that none of this was true, but the effort required to speak felt overwhelming. Instead, he focused on staying conscious, blinking rapidly to keep the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision at bay. One of the responding officers pressed a hand firmly against his wound, attempting to stem the flow of blood. "Stay with us, sir," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Help is on the way." Despite the pain, Marcus couldn't help but notice how different these officers seemed compared to Grayson. They weren't hostile or accusatory. Instead, they treated him with a level of care and professionalism that stood in stark contrast to the treatment he'd received moments earlier. It was a small comfort, but one he clung to as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Meanwhile, Grayson's story wasn't adding up. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances as they reviewed the details of the incident. One of them retrieved Grayson's body camera, which had been recording the entire encounter. As they watched the footage on the spot, their expressions grew increasingly grim. The video clearly showed Marcus following orders, keeping his hands visible and showing no signs of aggression. There was no justification for the use of lethal force, not even close. Back on the ground, Marcus's thoughts drifted between flashes of clarity and waves of dizziness. He thought about his family, his friends, the people who depended on him both personally and professionally. Would he survive this? And if he did, what kind of justice could he expect in a system that often seemed stacked against people like him? These questions swirled in his mind, heavy and suffocating, as the paramedics finally arrived on the scene. The ambulance pulled up with its lights flashing, casting eerie shadows across the street. Two medics jumped out carrying a stretcher and medical supplies. They knelt beside Marcus, quickly assessing his injury before loading him onto the stretcher. "You're going to be okay," one of them assured him. Though Marcus wasn't sure, he believed it. The bullet had struck him hard and the amount of blood he'd lost was alarming. Still, he nodded faintly, grateful for any reassurance they could offer. As the medics worked to stabilize him, another officer approached. This one wearing a badge that identified him as part of the Internal Affairs Division. Internal Affairs officers were tasked with investigating misconduct within the police force, and their presence signaled that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug, at least, not without scrutiny. The investigator crouched near Marcus, speaking gently. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Marcus took a deep, shaky breath, forcing himself to focus despite the haze of pain and exhaustion. "I was pulled over," he began, his voice hoarse but determined. "I wasn't speeding, I wasn't doing anything wrong. Officer Grayson accused me of reaching for something, but I wasn't. I was cooperating fully." Each word cost him immense effort, but he knew it was important to share his side of the story while it was fresh in his mind. The investigator nodded, jotting notes on a small pad. "Thank you, sir. We'll look into this thoroughly." His tone was reassuring, though Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that promises like these were often easier said than fulfilled. By now, a small crowd had gathered nearby, drawn by the commotion. Neighbors peered curiously from behind curtains, or stood on their front lawns whispering among themselves. A few held cell phones aloft, capturing footage of the scene. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She had heard the gunshot and come outside to see what was happening. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth as she watched the paramedics load Marcus into the ambulance. "Oh my goodness," she murmured to a neighbor standing beside her. "That poor man. What on earth happened?" No one had answers, but speculation spread quickly. Someone mentioned seeing Grayson yelling at Marcus earlier, his behavior described as aggressive and unprofessional. Another recalled hearing raised voices and the unmistakable crack of gunfire shortly afterward. By the time the ambulance sped away, sirens blaring, the neighborhood buzzed with theories and outrage. Back at the scene, Grayson was escorted to his patrol car where he sat slumped in the driver's seat, his head in his hands. Fellow officers questioned him further, pressing for specifics about why he had fired his weapon. His responses were disjointed, defensive, and increasingly contradictory. "I swear I thought he was dangerous," he insisted, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. He was moving too fast. I didn't have time to think." But the body cam footage told a different story, one that painted Grayson's actions as reckless and unjustified. Officers reviewing the tape exchanged uneasy looks, knowing full well the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a case of accidental escalation. This was a blatant misuse of power, fueled by bias and poor judgment. As the investigation continued, news of the shooting began to spread beyond the confines of the quiet suburb. Social media lit up with posts from neighbors and eyewitnesses sharing snippets of information and videos captured on their phones. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Police Accountability trended locally, drawing attention to the incident. Commenters expressed anger and disbelief, calling for transparency and accountability. How could something like this happen in broad daylight, or rather under the glare of police lights? By morning, the story had made national headlines. Journalists descended upon the suburban neighborhood, interviewing residents and piecing together the events of the night before. Marcus's identity as a federal prosecutor added fuel to the fire, highlighting the disturbing irony of a legal professional being victimized by the very system he worked to uphold. Calls for justice grew louder, echoing far beyond the boundaries of Chicago. Lying in a hospital bed hours later, Marcus stared blankly at the ceiling, his leg elevated and bandaged, an IV drip attached to his arm. The physical pain was manageable thanks to medication, but the emotional toll weighed heavily on him. He replayed the events of the night over and over in his mind, searching for answers that never came. Why had Grayson targeted him? Was it truly about race, or was there something deeper, a festering resentment or unchecked hatred that had boiled over in those critical moments? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear: Marcus's life, and the lives of countless others, was forever changed by what had transpired. The road to healing, both physically and emotionally, would be long and arduous. But as he closed his eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, Marcus vowed to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved better from the institutions meant to protect them. The days following the shooting were a whirlwind of activity, both for Marcus and the community at large. News outlets couldn't get enough of the story. A federal prosecutor, a man who dedicated his career to upholding justice, had been shot by a police officer during what should have been a routine traffic stop. The irony was staggering, and it struck a chord with people across the country. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage as images of Marcus lying wounded on the pavement circulated alongside snippets of body cam footage that painted Officer Grayson's actions in an increasingly damning light. For Marcus, recovery wasn't just physical. It was emotional and psychological. Lying in his hospital bed, he found himself replaying the incident over and over again in his mind. Each time, he tried to pinpoint where things had gone wrong, searching for some clue or detail that might explain why this had happened to him. But no matter how many times he analyzed the situation, the answer always came back to one uncomfortable truth. He had been targeted because of who he was. His skin color, his profession, even the way he carried himself, all of it had contributed to Grayson's decision to escalate the encounter so violently. Despite the pain medication coursing through his veins, sleep eluded Marcus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of red and blue lights, heard the deafening crack of the gunshot, and felt the searing agony of the bullet tearing through his leg. Nightmares plagued him, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Nurses checked on him frequently, their faces etched with concern. "You've been through something traumatic," one of them said gently during a particularly rough night. It's okay to feel scared or angry. Healing takes time. But Marcus didn't want to take time. He wanted answers. He wanted accountability. And most of all, he wanted to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what he had. So when reporters began calling the hospital, asking for interviews, Marcus decided it was time to speak out. From his hospital bed, surrounded by wires and monitors, he gave his first public statement. I'm alive today because I'm lucky. Marcus began, his voice steady despite the exhaustion written across his face. But luck shouldn't be the reason anyone survives an encounter with law enforcement. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much bigger problem. Racism and bias exist within our systems, and they put innocent lives at risk every single day. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations about systemic racism and police brutality not only in Chicago but nationwide. Protesters took to the streets holding signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Violence." They marched peacefully, chanting slogans and demanding reforms. Some held vigils outside the hospital, lighting candles and praying for Marcus's recovery while also calling for Grayson's arrest. Others organized online petitions, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures in support of federal investigations into policing practices. Social media played a pivotal role in amplifying the movement. Videos of Marcus's interview went viral, drawing millions of views and shares. Influencers, activists, and everyday citizens used their platforms to spread awareness and call for change. Hashtags like Dockhorn Accountability Now and Aqua Stand with Marcus trended for days, keeping the conversation alive and ensuring that the incident remained in the public eye. Even celebrities weighed in, using their massive followings to amplify Marcus's message and demand justice. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on local authorities to act. The police department issued a carefully worded statement, condemning the use of excessive force and promising a thorough investigation. However, many viewed the response as insufficient, pointing out that similar promises had been made in the past without resulting in meaningful action. Community leaders called for transparency, insisting that the entire process, from the initial review of evidence to potential charges against Grayson, be conducted openly and fairly. Documents leaked during the investigation only added fuel to the fire. Internal records revealed a troubling pattern of misconduct in Grayson's past, including multiple complaints of racial profiling and aggressive behavior. Several of these incidents had involved allegations of unnecessary escalation, yet none had resulted in disciplinary action. Critics argued that this lack of accountability had emboldened Grayson, allowing his biases to go unchecked until they culminated in the shooting of Marcus. The revelations sparked outrage not just among activists but also within the ranks of law enforcement. Some officers publicly condemned Grayson's actions, emphasizing the importance of trust between police and the communities they served. "This is not who we are supposed to be," one veteran cop told reporters during a press conference. "We take an oath to protect and serve, not to harm. What happened here is unacceptable, and it tarnishes the badge we all wear." Others, however, defended Grayson, claiming that split-second decisions in high-pressure situations were inherently difficult and that second-guessing officers after the fact was unfair. These conflicting perspectives highlighted the deep divisions within law enforcement itself, underscoring the challenges of implementing meaningful reform. As the debate raged on, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and determination. Messages of support poured in from around the world, filling his hospital room with cards, letters, and flowers. Strangers sent heartfelt notes thanking him for speaking out and vowing to join the fight for justice. Friends and family visited regularly, offering comfort and encouragement. His mother, a retired schoolteacher, sat by his bedside for hours, holding his hand and reminding him of his strength. "You've always stood up for what's right," she told him one afternoon. "Don't let this break you. Use it to make a difference." Inspired by the overwhelming show of solidarity, Marcus began planning his next steps. Though still recovering from his injury, he knew he couldn't stay silent. This moment presented an opportunity, not just to seek justice for himself, but to push for broader changes in policing and accountability. With the help of colleagues and legal experts, he drafted a proposal for a new advocacy group focused on addressing racial bias in law enforcement. The organization would work to educate officers, implement stricter oversight measures, and provide resources for victims of police misconduct. Word of the initiative spread quickly, drawing interest from influential figures and organizations eager to contribute. Donations poured in, along with offers of pro bono legal assistance and partnerships with civil rights groups. Marcus realized that his experience, painful as it was, had given him a unique platform, one he could use to effect real change. Back in the neighborhood where the shooting had occurred, tensions lingered. Residents continued to grapple with the aftermath of the incident, torn between anger at Grayson's actions and hope that something positive might come from the tragedy. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to improve relations with local law enforcement, with residents urging officials to prioritize training and accountability. A makeshift memorial sprang up near the site of the shooting, adorned with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes expressing grief and solidarity. Through it all, Marcus remained steadfast in his resolve. He understood that healing wouldn't happen overnight, for himself or for society, but he refused to give up. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. As he gazed out the window of his hospital room one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a glimmer of hope. The world was paying attention now, and maybe, just maybe, this moment could mark the beginning of something better. The internal investigation into Officer Grayson's actions began with a flurry of activity. The police department, under intense public scrutiny, moved quickly to assemble a special task force dedicated to reviewing the incident. This team included seasoned investigators, legal experts, and representatives from community organizations who were invited to ensure transparency. For Marcus, this phase of the process was both nerve-wracking and frustrating. While he appreciated the efforts to hold Grayson accountable, he couldn't shake the feeling that these investigations often dragged on for months, or even years, without delivering real justice. As the days turned into weeks, details about Grayson's past behavior started to emerge, painting a troubling picture of an officer whose conduct had long raised red flags. Leaked documents revealed a pattern of complaints filed against him by members of the community, many of which accused him of racial profiling and excessive force. One particularly damning report came from a young black man who claimed Grayson had pulled him over multiple times without cause, each encounter escalating in aggression until the man feared for his safety. Another complaint involved Grayson allegedly using derogatory language during a domestic dispute call, prompting outrage among witnesses who later spoke out. What shocked Marcus and the broader public was how none of these allegations had resulted in disciplinary action. Internal review boards had dismissed them as unsubstantiated or chalked them up to misunderstandings. Even when evidence supported the claims, such as dashcam footage showing Grayson berating drivers based on their race, no consequences followed. It seemed as though Grayson operated with near-total impunity, shielded by a system that prioritized protecting its own over holding officers accountable. This revelation sparked widespread anger and disbelief. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, chanting slogans like "No more excuses" and "Fire the bad cops." Community leaders held press conferences demanding immediate reforms, pointing to Grayson's case as proof that current oversight mechanisms were failing spectacularly. "How many more lives will be ruined before we admit there's a problem?" asked Reverend James Carter, a prominent civil rights advocate, during one fiery speech. Officer Grayson didn't become dangerous overnight. He was allowed to operate unchecked because we failed to act when we had the chance. Amidst the growing outcry, federal authorities stepped in, opening their own inquiry into whether Grayson's actions constituted a hate crime. This development marked a turning point in the case, signaling that higher powers recognized the severity of what had happened. Federal prosecutors assigned to the investigation worked closely with local law enforcement, combing through every piece of available evidence, from body cam footage to witness testimonies, to build a comprehensive case for court. Marcus, This phase of the investigation brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt relieved that his experience was being taken seriously at the highest levels. The involvement of federal agencies meant that Grayson wouldn't simply walk away with a slap on the wrist or a brief suspension. On the other hand, reliving the trauma of that night over and again took a toll on his mental health. Investigators interviewed him repeatedly, asking him to recount every detail of the traffic stop. From the moment Grayson approached his car to the instant the bullet struck his leg. Each retelling reopened old wounds, leaving him emotionally drained. To cope, Marcus leaned heavily on his support network. His family visited daily, bringing food, laughter, and reminders of happier times. Friends sent encouraging messages, while colleagues offered professional advice and assistance. One friend, a therapist specializing in trauma recovery, encouraged Marcus to seek counseling to help process everything he'd been through. At first, Marcus resisted, believing he could handle it on his own. But after another sleepless night filled with nightmares, he decided to give therapy a try. Those sessions proved invaluable, providing him with tools to manage his anxiety and regain a sense of control over his life. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified, shining a spotlight not just on Grayson's actions, but also on systemic issues within policing. Journalists dug deep, uncovering stories of similar incidents across the country where officers had used excessive force against individuals of color, often with little to no accountability. These reports painted a grim picture of a culture that tolerated, even enabled such behavior, perpetuating cycles of mistrust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Public forums and town hall meetings became common as citizens demanded answers and solutions. In one packed auditorium, residents lined up to share their own experiences with police misconduct. A young woman recounted being handcuffed and detained for hours after being mistakenly identified as a suspect in a robbery. An elderly man described how officers had roughed him up during a wellness check, leaving him bruised and humiliated. Each story added weight to the argument that reform was not only necessary, but urgent. Lawmakers responded by introducing bills aimed at increasing police accountability. Some proposed measures included mandatory body cameras for all officers, stricter penalties for misconduct, and independent oversight committees to investigate allegations of wrongdoing. Others called for reallocating funds from police budgets to invest in social services like mental health care and education, arguing that addressing root causes of crime would reduce the need for aggressive policing tactics. While these discussions gave hope to many, skepticism remained. Critics pointed out that similar promises of reform had been made in the past, only to fizzle out once public attention waned. "We've seen this movie before," said activist Maria Gonzalez during a televised panel discussion. "People get outraged, politicians make speeches, and then nothing changes. If we want real progress, we have to stay vigilant. We can't let this momentum die." Marcus agreed wholeheartedly. Determined to keep the pressure on, he partnered with advocacy groups to launch a nationwide campaign focused on policy change. Dubbed Justice Beyond the Badge, the initiative sought to educate the public about systemic racism in policing while pushing for legislative reforms. Volunteers distributed flyers, organized rallies, and lobbied elected officials to prioritize meaningful action. Social media played a key role, with influencers amplifying the message and encouraging followers to contact their representatives. Despite the challenges, Marcus found solace in the growing movement. Seeing people from all walks of life come together to demand change reminded him why he had chosen a career in law. It wasn't just about prosecuting criminals, it was about fighting for fairness, equality, and justice for everyone. And though his journey toward healing was far from over, he drew strength from knowing he wasn't alone. Together, they were building something bigger than themselves, a future where no one would have to endure what he had. As the investigation continued, anticipation built around what charges might be filed against Grayson. Legal experts debated the likelihood of a conviction, weighing factors like precedent cases and potential defenses. Meanwhile, Grayson himself remained largely out of sight, reportedly on administrative leave pending the outcome of the probe. Rumors swirled about his mental state, with some claiming he was struggling to cope with the backlash while others suggested he remained defiant, convinced he'd done nothing wrong. Through it all, Marcus stayed focused on the bigger picture. Whether Grayson faced jail time or walked free, the true measure of success would lie in the systemic changes spurred by this tragedy. Every protest, every petition, every conversation about bias and accountability brought them one step closer to that goal. And though the scars, both visible and invisible, would always remain, Marcus vowed to keep moving forward, driven by the belief that a better world was possible if enough people refused to settle for less.